When I came here, several people asked me how I really do pronounce my name. Well, I pronounce it myself in Swedish, Hammarskjöld. But if you say Hammarskjöld, that's all right with me.
All right? All right, Mr. Lee, loud.
Dag Hammarskjöld, I wish you from the bottom of my heart, welcome to New York and to the United Nations headquarters. You are going to take over the most impossible job on earth. But I wish you all luck and all the best.
Welcome to Right Place, Right Time. Today, we begin a two-part series on one of the most consequential moments in African history. On 30 June 1960, the Democratic Republic of Congo gained independence. Within days, the country plunged into chaos. As the Cold War powers rushed in, the UN intervened, led by the Secretary General, Dag Hammarskjöld. More than 60 years later, Hammarskjöld's fatal plane crash near Ndola remains one of history's greatest unresolved mysteries. Joining us to unravel this story is Professor Henning Melber, one of the world's leading scholars on decolonization, Cold War international relations, as well as a senior advisor and director emeritus at the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. He is also the author of Dag Hammarskjöld, the United Nations and Decolonization of Africa, amongst other books. Professor, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Steve, and thank you especially for these very flattering introductory remarks.
We're glad to have you. We're glad to have you. Now, before we dive into the conversation, I want to extend a special note of gratitude to a friend of yours, Dr. Susan Williams, a senior research fellow at the Institute of Commonwealth Studies in the University of London, and the author of the groundbreaking book, Who Killed Hammarskjöld? Dr. William was very kind enough to connect us with you. Without her support, this conversation probably would not have happened. She spoke very highly of you, by the way, Prof. So again, we are very grateful for her pointing us into your direction.
Let me just add, Steve, that what you said about me applies in every detail to Susan Williams. When it comes to the subject of our conversation, she deserves the credit, not only for this conversation taking place between us, but also for playing the ultimate pioneering role that the attention has been reactivated to look into what happened in the Congo then, and especially in the killing of Dag Hammarskjöld. And notably, I use the word killing and not death.
Wow. I can already tell this will be a wonderful conversation just by the direction you've already taken. Yeah, but I mean, she is a wonderful lady. And I'm sure after this, I'm sure she will be very happy to see what we'll have done here. Before we proceed, there's another interesting person that I want to talk about, and that's you. Where did this love, let me call the love for Africa, start for you?
I was born in southern Germany, and some who are familiar with dialects might figure out that I have a German dialect, even if I left that region with the age of 16. I emigrated with my mother and my brother to Southwest Africa, today's Namibia, in the mid-1960s. And by the time I finished school, I considered Namibia as my new home. And I usually refer to myself as a German-born Namibian living in Sweden. I joined the anti-colonial movement SWAPO 51 years ago. I was banned from re-entering for 15 years and could then return at independence, presumably to spend the rest of my life to implement the values and principles we were fighting for, the declared values of solidarity, freedom, and justice. But heading a local think tank established at independence to provide policy advice to the government, meaning my comrades, I became increasingly critical of what I call the limits to liberation, which made me not very popular among my comrades. I therefore accepted in 2000 the offer to relocate to Uppsala in Sweden as the first research director of the Nordic Africa Institute, one of the biggest research institutes on Africa in Europe. And from there, I moved on 6 years later to become the executive director of the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, also in Uppsala. And Dag Hammarskjöld became a role model for me because of my own testing principled values and integrity. Keywords for me, and I think also for Dag Hammarskjöld.
Oh, yes.
So when the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation asked me if I would be willing to join them to lead the foundation, it was like coming a full circle in completing a professional career. And I accepted it for the reasons that Dag Hammarskjöld very much personified European solidarity with the struggle for decolonization globally, but in particular in Africa, sacrificed even his life for the values he believed in, and was for me the ultimate personification of living by principled values and integrity. So that's, in a summary, the background why I thought it's a very appropriate combination of being involved in African and development studies as a scholar and ending the professional career heading the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation.
There's so many things you've said in there, and I'm so tempted to ask some questions, but I know I don't want to enter into that rabbit hole for now because we are here for something else. I had so much questions on SWAPO and so many other things, but I think we'll park that for another day. Yeah, but that's a very glittering history. Namibia is one country that I've never understood in terms of its history and all. I'm sure one day I'll come back to you for that.
Let's see how the conversation unfolds. If you are satisfied with it and those who are putting aside the time to listen to us are satisfied with it, we might consider a follow-up on Namibia and liberation movements as governments and the limits to liberation.
Now, Dag Hammarskjöld, and I hope by them pronouncing the name okay. The first time that I got to hear the name Dag Hammarskjöld, I grew up listening to the BBC World Service because of my dad used to love the station. They used to have a program called History Witness where they just do a brief 5 minutes on a particular, let's say if it's on a particular day when something happened, they do a 5 minutes history on that particular topic. And that's the first time I heard about Dag Hammarskjöld because they did a small clip about him. The second time I heard about Dag Hammarskjöld is because a friend of mine referred me to a documentary around 6 years ago, a documentary called Cold Case Hammarskjöld, done by Mats Brugger and Goran something, some investigative documentary about trying to go to Ndola and all those other places just to see what happened. A very, I'll say, a well-done documentary. So that was the second time. But now what triggered my interest completely and basically threw me off the cliff was a conversation I had with one of our guests who's a Zambian, and we were talking about the Zambian team that crashed in 1993. So as we were going through the history of the Zambian team, he kept mentioning that in the 70s and the early 80s, there were two stadiums that the Zambian teams played. It was either in the Independence Stadium in Lusaka and another stadium in Ndola called the Dag Hammarskjöld Stadium. Now that got me thinking. Africa has had two UN Secretary Generals, Boutros Ghali, but I don't think there's a stadium in Egypt named after him. Probably I may be wrong. Even Kofi Annan in Ghana, I don't think there's a stadium named after him. But why would Zambia name a stadium after a name that doesn't look Zambian? That's what made me find out. Let me know more about Dag Hammarskjöld, and that's why we're having this conversation. So I'm sure there are people who are hearing the name for the first time and want to know who was Dag Hammarskjöld. We can start from there.
First of all, Steve, your pronunciation of the name is close to perfect.
Wow.
I don't know if you practiced it, but there's nothing you need to improve. Secondly, your examples show that Dag Hammarskjöld is not forgotten. He left behind a legacy which, at least indirectly, through the examples you mentioned, keep him alive, independent of the current investigations, which I'm sure we will talk about at a later time in our conversation. That in Dola there is a Dag Hammarskjöld Stadium relates to the site of the plane crash in which he and 15 others on board of the plane, all of his entourage, were killed. And there is a outside of Dola where the plane crashed, which is kept in very good shape, where there are regular annual meetings on the day of the crash, the 18th of September, with participation of the Zambian government, of local and regional nobilities, and of the Swedish embassy, the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, and others. If you visit the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, you come, for example, across a Dag Hammarskjöld bridge. You will find a Dag Hammarskjöld square. And you have Congolese citizens who, until the very day, keep Dag Hammarskjöld in high recognition and respect for the role he played. He was not free of controversies, but many people recognize him until the very day as the second Secretary General of the United Nations, who was serious about a level playing field in international relations, providing through the United Nations the countries of what is nowadays called the Global South an adequate voice. And he was willing to stand up for these convictions and principles and speak against those who executed and still execute hegemonic power in international relations.
He became the Secretary General in the early 50s, from childhood all the way to where he became the Secretary General. What kind of person and what kind of background did he have? What kind of family did he come from? Because these backgrounds always form the person, how a person becomes.
Dag Hammarskjöld was born in 1905, a highly influential political office bearer. His father, at the time of Hammarskjöld's birth, was negotiating away from home the independence of Norway, which until then was occupied by Sweden.
Oh, okay.
Sweden, until the very day, is very proud of having been able to release Norway into sovereignty in a peaceful way of negotiations and transitions. Sweden has this image of being a peaceful country, never involved in a war, which shows a little bit of a short memory because Sweden basically looted the rest of Europe until the 18th century. You go to Vienna, you go to German cities, you go even to Eastern Europe, the rest of the Nordic countries. The Swedes were in the footsteps of the Vikings. But then, almost miraculously, they decided to end engaging in wars. And this peaceful transition to Norwegian sovereignty was to a certain extent also the merit of Dag Hammarskjöld's father, who then was the governor of the Uppland region with the capital Uppsala, which is the reason why the family moved from Jönköping in Sweden to Uppsala when Dag Hammarskjöld was at the age of, I believe, 3 or so. So for him, Uppsala was the hometown all of his life until the very end. And he never turned his back on Swedish values and his hometown throughout his time, even as Secretary General. Now, to understand his belief in values and the duty to serve, then at the highest international civil servant as of 1953, you have to trace his socialization initially in Uppsala, where he went to school and studied law and economy, and then his career as a civil servant in the Swedish administration and even as a minister in the Swedish government. Notably, he never ever was a member of any political party, but he was a central figure in establishing the initial steps towards the Swedish welfare state. He was the head of the central bank. He was
Wow.
the finance minister, remarkably so at the same time, which nowadays would cause raised eyebrows. How could you be the head of the central bank and the finance minister? For him and Sweden of the time in the 90s, it was not a contradiction. He explained in one of his first speeches to a US American broadcasting company in 1953 where he came from and what his belief is. And he stressed that the values he integrated in his convictions were passed on by his father as a duty to serve in the best interest of the public. And he started to write a personal notebook as of 1925, the age of 20, which was posthumously published as Markings.
Yes, markings, yeah.
One of the latest editions with a preface of the late US President Jimmy Carter, who also, while considered a failed US president, was maybe the best US president ever when it came to living up to human rights convictions and fundamental human rights principles. And if you go through Markings, which has remained a bestseller until the very day, translated in numerous languages, then you see his spirituality, which is also a very important factor in the way he handled diplomacy, but also his permanent conviction that life has to be understood as a duty to serve. It's at times a very painful reading because you ask yourself, where did he have pleasures in life? And the answer is most likely the pleasure was for him to fulfill this duty. And he often even went to the area where he questioned what makes life worthy to continue. And it was this conviction to serve in the best interest of others. Notably, despite his spirituality, which is often referred to, he was a very secular person. I mentioned already he studied law and graduated in law. He graduated in economics and he did a PhD in economics with Gunnar Myrdal as his examiner. Gunnar Myrdal, who played a very influential international role as of the mid-1940s and then in the 1950s in the United Nations. The two were not in agreement. They had different schools of thought when it comes to economics. And Gunnar Myrdal was not impressed by the school of thought that Dag Hammarskjöld cultivated. But when he was the examiner, he acknowledged that Dag Hammarskjöld was totally competent in the subject, despite his differences in what he said. And it's noteworthy because Dag Hammarskjöld has been so far the only Secretary General of the United Nations who had a PhD in economics. And that explains also why for him ECOSOC was more important than any other United Nations institution, even more important than the Security Council, because he from the beginning realized the asymmetries in global relations between the former colonial empires and the rest of the world. That again preempts a little bit what we are going to talk about later.
Yes.
But it's necessary to understand that we talk about a Swedish civil servant whose values were to serve the people and serving the people seen as the best reward in life.
Okay.
And he did so in his capacity as an economist during the 1930s and the 1940s. Mentioned that already. He was tasked by the Swedish government to be involved in post-World War II reconstruction of Germany through the Marshall Plan. And he then moved on in 1952 to head the Swedish delegation to the United Nations.
Wow.
And he, at the same time was very much involved in arts. When his father died, he became his successor in the Swedish Academy, which awards the Nobel Prize for Literature. If you look at the multiple interests and identities of Dag Hammarskjöld, who was fluent in 4 European languages, Swedish, English, French, and German, and was very familiar with intimate knowledge of several religions in the world, you could see that he was one of the few people who at this time deserved to be classified as a true cosmopolitan, while at the same time firmly anchored in the values of his place and society of origin. Saying that, I think it's an important lesson that if you have the ability of an open mind to so-called or perceived otherness, which when you engage with it turns out not to be very different or being other. The point of departure that allows you to do that with confidence and trust is that you know where you come from. That gives you the ability to meet others with curiosity and openness to engage for the benefit of all. And it sounds like an iconographic pedestal I put him on, but I truly believe, having read a lot of these more than 1,200 pages of his statements and speeches as Secretary General, that he really personified these values.
Wow. I'm just listening to the picture that you're creating in my mind. He was someone who was focused and he had people in his heart. Basically, he was not thinking about himself, just thinking about other people. And now it makes sense to me why you could say he was always getting in the line of fire. Ideally, as a Secretary General, you could send people to do the thing, but he would take on things personally, because clearly this was someone who had something driving him, and his most important welfare was people's welfare. And it's amazing whenever I hear, and as I've been doing my research on other people, I realize that there's something amazing about people who were in the civil service, especially back in the day. Not all of them, but you get a bunch of people who are in the civil service and they literally dedicate their life for the people. And Dag, I can clearly see Dag was one of them. How I wish we had some of them in our lives today. Yeah. Was he ever married? Oh, sorry, go on.
Maybe I should add he was a total workaholic. He had basically no private life.
No private life.
He had no private relationships.
Oh, okay.
Which in a rather unfair way was at times interpreted as having homosexual tendencies, which I think is unjustified. There's absolutely no evidence. If at all, he was not interested in any such physical relations. He was working 24/7. If you look at the archives in Stockholm, the letters he wrote, the books he translated, basically on the sideline of his activities, you wonder how is that physically and intellectually possible at all for any ordinary human being. And to share an anecdote, it started during his student days, where he was notorious among his fellow students, and then later as a civil servant, that he loved mountain hiking in the north of Sweden. And he spent the weekends there together with some friends, climbing the mountains in an astonishing pace, reciting poetry, asking them to recite poems. And in the evening, when the others were sitting exhausted around a campfire in front of a tent, he wanted for hours to discuss the poems that were recited during the day. And his bodyguards were afraid when he went on the rare excursions outside of New York to a private residence for the Secretary General, because he was pacing around the lake there in a speed where they said we can hardly follow him. So in many ways, Dag Hammarskjöld was really very, very unique as a person. Not only as Secretary General, there were so many different aspects. And there is one biography, the ultimate biography so far by Roger Lipsey, called Hammarskjöld. I can recommend to everyone who's interested in the subject because it really shows all the different nuances and facets of the person Dag Hammarskjöld, far beyond him serving as Secretary General of the United Nations. And Roger Lipsey compared him with a unicorn, which I think is a rather appropriate association. He was really a kind of its own.
At the time when, during his service, and he was serving the country, serving Europe after the war, and to the time until the time when he was part of the team that were part of the UN, representing Sweden in the UN, at that point, was it clear that he would ever want to be on the top job at the UN, or probably take his wings across the world, or he was purely serving the nation as at that particular time?
He never had any ambition to become Secretary General. And he ended as Secretary General by accident, or rather by the specific constellation of the emerging Cold War era in the early 1950s. What happened was that the first Secretary General was Trygve Lie from Norway, a trade union activist, very unorthodox. You could say he was a kind of maverick. And the Soviet Union started to utterly dislike his behavior, which they couldn't basically count on. He was a bit, you never knew what he came up with. So during his second term in office as Secretary General at the end of 1952, the Soviet Union basically decided to boycott everything he did, which made him untenable. So the Security Council faced no other choice than to look for a replacement in mid of his second term. And they looked around, and as it happens until the very day, they were looking for an appropriate candidate of compromise, where both parts, the Soviet bloc and the Western bloc, could agree. And for quite some time, with several proposals, they couldn't find someone they agreed upon. Until the French permanent representative at the United Nations said, "So what about Monsieur Dag Hammarskjöld?"
Wow.
And the others looked around and said, "Who?" Then they started to familiarize who is this Dag Hammarskjöld, the French pronunciation, to find out, oh yeah, it's this head of the UN delegation of Sweden, and he has quite an interesting track record. He never stuck out as being ideologically obsessed, being politically motivated in his duties. He seems to be very service-oriented. So the impression gained ground that he is the kind of civil servant who will execute what we tell him to do.
Yes, man.
How wrong can you be? And on that basis, he was phoned on the 1st of April 1953 from New York, asked if he would be willing to stand as a candidate for Secretary General of the United Nations. And due to the date, he initially thought it's a silly April's fool. So, and then he obviously asked the then Swedish Prime Minister. He didn't say yes or no. He said, I need time. He was not waiting for that. The Prime Minister gave him the go-ahead if he wanted to. So he really was thinking quite some time, within a day or two, before he decided that if this is duty calling, then he is willing to accept the call. And again, the ultimate motive was, if I'm supposed to serve the United Nations as Secretary General, then I will serve. But he always understood it as a mandate to serve the values and principles adopted through the Charter of the United Nations and all the subsequent conventions adopted by the United Nations. And this is what those who thought he is the most convenient choice overlooked.
I have a question for you there. For probably someone who may be like me and doesn't understand how it's done. Do they pick several people and vote for them and vote for one person? How do they choose a secretary general? Do all the countries vote, or how does it work?
They need to agree in the Security Council.
Okay.
And that's the decisive decision taken. Once
so the Big Five
Council agrees with no veto that this should be the nominated next Secretary General, the rest is formality. As basically in all the other matters, it's the Security Council, and in the Security Council, the 5 permanent members who have the ultimate power to decide on fundamental issues until the very day. And interesting that you asked me that, because Dag Hammarskjöld, while in office, was increasingly frustrated about these asymmetric power relations. And he, on several occasions, including the Congo, was trying to circumvent that the Security Council has the ultimate power to tell him what to do. He was the first Secretary General. Okay, he was the second, but for the first time as Secretary General, he made use of a clause in his mandate where he, as Secretary General, could submit a matter to the Security Council, forcing the Security Council to deal with the matter. And on several occasions, he was extremely frustrated that it's the Security Council which takes the decisions. And towards the end of his office, he was openly thinking and considering ways how one could strengthen the General Assembly of the United Nations in taking decisions which are not only tokenism, but really impact on policies and initiatives taken by the United Nations. This has not been solved until the very day.
Interesting. So I have a theory. It's not proven. It's my own theory. So anyone can shoot me for this. I have a theory that for you to be a UN Secretary General, you must have a very cool and interesting name. Because I look at the names of all the Secretary Generals. Oh, this is just me. I know it's not the qualifier, but look at Dag Hammarskjöld. That's such a wonderful name. Then the guy who followed him, Utant. It's called Utant. Another name. I mean, Boutros Ghali. Even the Ban Ki-moon. I mean, you have to have a cool name. So guys like me don't stand a chance. What do you think? Anyway, that's just by the way.
I tend to another explanation.
Yes.
The Secretary Generals have, for obvious reasons, a variety of cultural backgrounds.
Yes.
And names reflect cultures.
Yes.
So you get this bouquet of names which are quite appealing as you list them.
Yes.
But for that reason, if all the Secretary Generals would come, let's say, from Germany or from the UK or even from Nairobi, well, after several Secretary Generals, it would become a boring thing.
Yeah, that's good. That's good. Yeah, so Dag Hammarskjöld walks into the UN in the 1950s. And as we know from history, this is probably a few years after the World War ends in 1945. So the world is pulled to several axes. It's a very hot time in terms of conflicts around the world. We have the Korean War, we have Suez Canal crisis, and so many other. I think even Vietnam started from the 50s and headed all the way to the 70s. So he was walking into a fire, literally. How did he handle all these things?
Well, that's a question with reference to so many examples, which clearly goes beyond the time limit of our conversation. Let me maybe start from scratch. After World War II, the United Nations were institutionalized as a follow-up body to the League of Nations to address lessons from, by then, the biggest conflict in the world, culminating in the Holocaust, which also led to the fact that the first convention adopted by the United Nations was the Genocide Convention, a day before the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So the body clearly tried to establish a global reference framework for all sovereign states who join the United Nations as members, thereby subscribe to the principles in the Charter as a guiding compass to navigate conflicts in the world. As we know, while we are speaking, this has deteriorated the last couple of years to an extent that global relations are at the verge of collapse. They become from multipolarity to unipolarity, social Darwinism in international relations, where the powerful again decide on their own. But at the time when Hammarskjöld became the Secretary General of the United Nations, they had an influence in several ways. They also took over the mandates of the Trusteeship Council under the League of Nations. Hammarskjöld became Secretary General at the time of the wars you referred to, but also at the time of the Bandung Conference, which took place in 1952, a year before he took up office. That is widely considered as the formation of a global anti-colonial movement by the people dubbed by Frantz Fanon the wretched of the earth, who were fighting for human dignity, for sovereignty, for self-determination. Dag Hammarskjöld picked up the signs. He was the Secretary General during the wave of decolonization on the African continent. During his time in office, more African countries became independent and joined the United Nations than at any other time. And he actively promoted that. He, to some extent, also personified the winds of change. And he gave voice to these. And that also, to some extent, influenced his way of diplomatically seeking to reduce or even solve conflicts with the help of the United Nations. The Suez crisis in 1956-57 was the first one where he established a UN force, the Blue Helmets.
The Blue Helmets, oh, okay.
To maintain peace and get control over what was threatening to become a direct war between France and Great Britain on the one side and Egypt on the other side. And it showed his ability of hidden diplomacy, where he was able to pull strings behind the scenes, which achieved a Security Council resolution in which the USA and the Soviet Union supported with a yes vote the intervention of the United Nations in the Suez crisis, which made it impossible for France and the UK to veto. So they had to abstain because they couldn't veto a UN Security Council resolution which was supported by the United States. That showed his diplomatic skills. And already before, his breakthrough in the eyes of the big powers was when he achieved the release of prisoners of war, US American pilots, who in the Korea War were captured by China. And he did so not by open negotiations. He visited China, had conversations there with the vice president, not talking politics. He talked culture. He talked art. He didn't pose any demands for the release of these prisoners of war. And at his next birthday, which happens to be on the 29th of July every year.
5 days from now,
Yeah. He received a card from the Chinese president saying, by the way, we will release the US American prisoners of war. So indirectly, a birthday gift to Dag Hammarskjöld.
And the world, and
And
the US.
the Western powers were totally set back. How on earth could he achieve something like that? Which also shows that he resorted to ways and means to influence decision-making processes which went outside of hardcore politics.
Goodness, I didn't know about that aspect of the Korean War. That's amazing. That's amazing. Clearly, now I understand why he's revered all over the world. Now, I just want to dive into. I know there's so many things he went into, but now I want to take our focus to the Congo. At that time, it was the Belgian Congo in the 50s. So we have this country that is under the yoke of the Belgians, and moving on is now getting into independence, as I said in the intro. But immediately after independence, there's a problem. And Dag Hammarskjöld gets involved right from the start. Maybe you can take us from there.
Well, first of all, maybe just to clarify for some of those who follow our conversation, there exist two Congos.
Yes. Oh, yes. Yes.
And the Belgian Congo is what later became the so-called Zaire and is now the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The big Congo, so to say.
Yes.
There is what is nowadays called the People's Republic of the Congo, which is the smaller part on the other side of the Congo.
Yes, Congo-Brazzaville.
Yeah, Congo-Brazzaville, exactly. In contrast to Congo-Kinshasa.
Yes.
The Belgian Congo was one of the most important strategic colonies at the time. As until today, extremely rich in natural resources, minerals, notably at the time the biggest producer of uranium, which was exploited by the Belgian mining company Union Minière de Katanga. And this was the uranium in the late 1940s and throughout the 1950s, which was the major supply for the nuclear armament of the United States of America.
Okay, interesting.
And the two atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were with uranium from Katanga, the Katangese province of the Belgian Congo. So the Katanga province is of the most special interest when it comes to natural resources and has remained so until the very day, also for other minerals, earth metals, lithium, cobalt, and so on. That made it a strategic interest, particularly for the West, but also for the East, what will be the future of the Belgian Congo. By the late 1950s, it became obvious for the Belgian king, who had appropriated the country as his private possession, with atrocious consequences for the people in the early 20th century when caoutchouc was produced. And we have horrific stories about King Leopold's empire, meaning Congo, the so-called Belgian Congo. It became obsolete to maintain colonial rule. So power was transferred to a Congolese government in the assumption that it will maintain business as usual. But with Patrice Lumumba, a Congolese nationalist, became the head of government, who to some extent was an anti-imperialist. So the vested interests of the West were at stake. And they blamed him, I would say deliberately, but wrongly so, being a communist. As like in many other cases of African decolonization, the leaders were nationalists. They believed in self-determination. They were not ideologically programmed towards the Soviet Union or the Western world. But the Western world was not able to handle the degree of autonomy those nationalist leaders expected to have in negotiating the best future for their countries with all other countries. So the result was that when Patrice Lumumba made a rather offending speech in the eyes of the Belgians at the independence ceremonies, that Belgium started to already plot his removal.
Oh,
And it happened within months.
yes.
He was ousted from office, and it was basically the beginning of something that translated into civil war. And the Katangese leader Moise Tshombe, with the backing and support of Belgium and other Western countries, and a number of mercenaries from quite a number of Western countries, declared secession from the Congo. That was the setting of a conflict which, strictly speaking, in different forms since then, has never abandoned an international presence in the Congo through the United Nations. It was creating a conflict in permanence from 1959, 1960 to the very day. And we are speaking conflicts in the Congo remain acute. The interests have shifted, but the strategic relevance of this resource-rich country makes it, in the eyes of too many others, including neighboring states now while we are speaking, a potential to flip on. So that was the situation in 1959. After the official declaration of independence, the Congo was basically paralyzed to execute self-determination and sovereignty in the true meaning of the word. It turned into a conflict between Western and Eastern interests.
Okay. Wow. It's amazing. I don't think there's been a country that has unraveled immediately after independence as the Congo did, as you've mentioned, as you've greatly taken us through that brief history of the Congo. Now, we are going to pause this episode here because we have managed to bolt Professor's doors and windows, and we even shackled his feet so that he's not going anywhere until we get to learn what happened next. So for now, that's the end of this first episode. Where do we resume? We shall continue from where things were unraveling in Congo and see how Dag Hammarskjöld comes into this whole story. For now, bye-bye.